Okay, let's unpack this. You shared some fascinating material with us, excerpts analyzing Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus.
Mm,
For this deep dive, our mission is really to understand Ehrman's core argument, why it caused such a stir, and, what it all boils down to for how you approach the New Testament.
right. And the central point of misquoting Jesus is, well, that the New Testament we read today isn't a perfect carbon copy of the original writings. Not exactly.
Okay.
Ehrman contends that over the centuries of hand copying, both unintentional mistakes and deliberate alterations found their way into the manuscripts.
And that naturally brings up some pretty significant questions, doesn't it, about the accuracy, the reliability of the Bible? Something I know is definitely on your mind.
Absolutely. It touches on some core issues for many people.
So we're going to explore why Ehrman thinks this happened, dig into some of the specific examples he and others discuss, and understand how the academic world has responded to his claims.
Sort of a shortcut to the debate.
Think of this as your shortcut, to grasping a really pivotal discussion in the study of the Bible. Here's where it gets really interesting. So, to start, who exactly is Bart Ehrman, and why did this particular book cause such a ripple effect?
Right. Bart D. Ehrman, he's a very well-respected scholar in New Testament studies. Misquoting Jesus, which came out back in 2005, it really propelled his academic work into the public consciousness in a big way.
It seemed to hit a nerve.
It did. And what makes his perspective particularly notable is his own intellectual journey, his personal story. He actually began as a devout evangelical Christian.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, someone who held a very traditional view of the Bible, divinely inspired, completely without error in its original form.
The classic inerrancy position.
Exactly. But his intensive study of the Greek New Testament, especially during his doctoral work at Princeton, it led him somewhere else. He encountered numerous variations, errors, and what he came to believe were intentional modifications within the manuscript tradition.
So it's almost like a testimony in reverse, as some have described it.
That's a good way to put it. That personal shift from believing in a perfectly preserved text to concluding that it, wasn't?
Yeah.
That really seemed to resonate with a lot of readers.
Especially those maybe from similar religious backgrounds.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what were the key factors that led him to believe these changes crept in over time?
Yeah, what's the reasoning?
Well, Ehrman emphasizes a really crucial point about the nature of early Christianity. Unlike many other ancient religions, Christianity, stemming from its Jewish roots, was fundamentally a religion of the book.
Right. The scriptures were central from the start.
Absolutely. The Hebrew scriptures were central, and Jesus himself operated within that textual tradition. However, when we look at the earliest days of the Christian movement and their own emerging texts, the landscape was quite different.
How so?
Literacy rates across the Roman Empire were surprisingly low. We're talking likely only around 10 to 15%.
Wow, just 10 to 15%. That completely reframes how I picture the early church.
It really does. Even figures as prominent as Peter and John are described in the book of Acts as illiterate or unlettered.
So if the vast majority couldn't read, who was actually doing the crucial work of copying these texts?
Exactly. That's Ehrman's point. He argues that in the first few centuries, the copies of the New Testament weren't being produced in like a controlled environment by highly trained professional scribes.
Not like the later monasteries we might imagine.
Precisely. Not like the medieval period with monastic scriptoriums. Instead, the task often fell to literate individuals within local church communities.
Just whoever could read and write.
Perhaps someone who had basic reading and writing skills. Maybe even a literate slave within a household church. It's a very different scenario compared to the later, more formalized systems,
I see.
where copying was considered a sacred duty with, dedicated resources and protocols, plus the physical process itself, copying by hand onto papyrus. It was inherently susceptible to errors.
Just simple mistakes.
Sure, misreading similar letters, mishearing if someone was reading aloud to be copied, or simply making slips of the pen. It happens.
That paints a much clearer picture of how unintentional mistakes could easily happen. Now, this brings us to the field of textual criticism, right? This is the scholarly discipline that tries to sort through all these variations and get as close as possible to the original wording.
Precisely. Textual criticism is the academic field dedicated to studying ancient manuscripts. The goal is reconstructing the most likely original wording of a text.
Okay.
And Ehrman provides a helpful overview of how this discipline developed. It starts with early pioneers like Erasmus. He produced the first printed Greek New Testament in the 16th century.
Right.
And it progresses to the much more sophisticated methodologies scholars use today.
What do those involve?
Well, these modern methods involve a detailed analysis of various factors: the age and geographical origin of the manuscripts, their overall textual character, grouping them into families based on shared readings.
Ah, like manuscript families.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, an understanding of the types of errors that scribes were known to commonly make.
Okay.
They also operate under a key principle. The reading that best explains how the other variant readings might have arisen is often considered the most likely original.
That makes sense. And one of the points that Ehrman emphasizes quite dramatically is the sheer volume of these differences across the thousands of surviving manuscripts.
Yes, the numbers.
He often cites figures like 200,000 to 400,000 variants. That number sounds incredibly staggering. It makes you wonder about the state of the text.
It does sound overwhelming, and that's often the initial impression that Ehrman's presentation can create. It's factually correct that if you tally up every single variation across all the thousands of surviving Greek New Testament manuscripts, you do arrive at these very large numbers.
But,
and this is a crucial point, the vast majority of these variants are actually quite insignificant.
Like what?
We're talking about things like minor spelling differences, and remember, spelling wasn't standardized back then.
Right, no dictionaries?
Exactly. Variations in word order that don't actually alter the meaning in Greek. The use of synonyms, accidental omissions, or repetitions of single, often small words.
Okay.
And just plain nonsensical errors that no serious scholar would ever consider as part of the original text.
So the big number isn't quite as scary as it sounds initially.
Well, it sounds alarming, but it actually highlights something incredible. The sheer volume of effort dedicated to preserving these texts over centuries. Despite the human errors, the core message was deemed so important that countless copies were made.
So it's not like we have hundreds of thousands of radically different versions of the New Testament floating around out there.
Exactly. The very high number is also a direct consequence of having such a wealth of surviving manuscript evidence.
Which is actually a good thing for scholars.
In most cases, yes, it's a significant advantage. It provides them with far more data points to work with than we have for most other ancient texts.
Interesting.
Now, critics of Ehrman sometimes argue that he presents these large numbers without maybe sufficient context,
creating more alarm.
Potentially creating a false sense of textual instability for a non-specialist audience. They might see it as a rhetorical strategy rather than a fully balanced picture.
Okay, so the vast majority are essentially minor typos or insignificant variations. But Ehrman also argues that there are a smaller subset of changes that appear to be more substantial.
Correct.
How did those kinds of alterations come about?
Ehrman identifies two main categories for these more significant changes. First, there are the unintentional errors that we've already touched on.
Like misreading.
Things like misreading letters that look similar, accidentally skipping over lines if two lines happen to end with the same word or phrase.
Oh, right.
That's known as homeoteleton. Or repeating words or phrases unintentionally, dictography, and sometimes incorporating marginal notes into the main body of the text in a subsequent copy.
So someone wrote a note in the margin and the next copier thought it was part of the text.
That seems to have happened, yes. Those all sound like the kinds of mistakes anyone could make when copying something by hand at length.
Sure, understandable human errors. But then he delves into the more controversial territory of intentional alterations.
This is where it gets complex.
What were the primary motivations behind those, according to Ehrman's research?
Right. This is where the discussion becomes particularly nuanced, and also where much of the scholarly debate surrounding Ehrman's work lies. He posits that some scribes deliberately modify the text for a variety of reasons.
Okay, like what?
One key motivation he highlights is harmonization.
Harmonization?
Yeah, where a scribe might alter a passage in one gospel account to make it more closely aligned with a parallel account in another gospel.
Ah, trying to smooth out perceived discrepancies between, say, Matthew and Luke.
Exactly, or variations between them. Another potential motivation was theological correction.
Fixing the theology.
If a particular passage seemed to present a theological difficulty or ambiguity, a scribe might change the wording to bring it more in line with what they believe to be orthodox or correct doctrine. He also argues that some alterations were made specifically to combat heresy.
Fighting theological battles in the text itself.
That's the idea. For example, some early groups, known as Docetists, believed Jesus only appeared to be human.
Right, like a phantom.
Ehrman suggests that some scribes might have altered passages to more strongly emphasize Jesus' physical reality in response to these ideas.
Okay.
Similarly, groups known as adoptionists believe Jesus was born human and later adopted by God. Scribes arguing against this might emphasize Jesus' divinity from the very beginning.
So, using the texts as a tool in these early theological debates.
That's the core of Ehrman's argument regarding intentional changes, yes.
Wow.
He also suggests that the process of doctrinal development itself played a role. Later scribes might subtly adjust wording to provide clearer support for emerging doctrines, like the Trinity.
Making the text fit later beliefs more neatly.
Potentially. And finally, he touches on the influence of social concerns. He proposes that some alterations might have reflected the social context of the time, perhaps subtly downplaying the role or authority of women in the early church.
That's quite a range of possible motivations.
It is.
It's fascinating to consider these possibilities, but it also seems incredibly challenging to definitively know the motivations of someone who made a change centuries ago.
That's a really critical point. And it's a major area where Ehrman's work has faced scrutiny.
Right. How can we be sure why they did it?
Exactly. While scholars generally acknowledge that intentional changes did occur, the specific motivations he attributes to particular alterations are often a matter of debate and interpretation. It's very difficult to get inside the mind of a scribe from the 2nd or 3rd century.
Sure.
Critics argue that Ehrman sometimes presents his interpretation of a scribe's theological motive as maybe a definitive fact, when there could be other plausible explanations.
Like what?
Well, perhaps it was still an accidental error. Or maybe the scribe was working from a different manuscript tradition that already contained that reading, and they genuinely believed that was the more accurate version.
So not necessarily a deliberate theological change.
Not necessarily. Ehrman's earlier work, particularly The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, really emphasizes these theological conflicts as the primary driving force behind many variants, and some scholars find that approach to be perhaps overly speculative.
Okay, so we have the landscape, unintentional errors, and these potentially intentional changes driven by various factors. Now, let's delve into some of the specific examples that Ehrman highlights.
Let's do it.
He argues these aren't just minor textual quirks. They can actually have implications for how we understand key passages. Let's start with the example from Mark 1.41.
Mark 1.41. Jesus heals a leper. Some of the earliest and most respected manuscripts say Jesus was moved with compassion.
That sounds familiar.
Right. But other manuscripts, also early ones, say he was indignant or even angry.
Angry, that's very different.
The original Greek words are quite distinct. Ehrman suggests that angry might actually represent the original reading. And if so, it gives us a slightly different perspective on Jesus' emotional state, doesn't it?
Yeah, was it pure pity, or was there anger at the disease itself?
Right. Now, most textual critics today tend to favor compassion as the original, based on a complex analysis.
Oh, okay.
But the angry reading certainly has significant early support. It remains a point of scholarly discussion. It really highlights how even a single word choice can potentially shape our understanding.
Definitely. Another example he brings up that sounds quite significant is Luke 22.4344, the passage describing Jesus' intense agony and bloody sweat in Gethsemane.
Yes, this is a particularly interesting case. Ehrman points out that this entire passage, which vividly portrays Jesus' human struggle, his reliance on divine comfort, is completely absent from some of our very earliest and most highly regarded manuscripts.
Like which ones?
Like Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, major early manuscripts.
Wow, completely missing.
Completely missing. He proposes the possibility that it might have been a later addition to Luke's Gospel.
Why would it have been added?
Perhaps to emphasize Jesus' full humanity, his emotional and physical suffering leading up to the crucifixion, maybe in response to early theological views that downplayed his genuine human nature.
But there's debate.
Oh yes, ongoing scholarly debate. Some argue it was original to Luke and might have been deliberately omitted later for various theological reasons.
And then there's the well-known story of the woman caught in adultery in John 7.53:8.11. That one always feels a bit separate when you read it.
That's a very astute observation, and it aligns with the conclusions of most textual critics. Ehrman, along with the vast majority of scholars, notes that this entire narrative isn't found in any of the early, reliable manuscripts of John's Gospel.
None of them.
None of the earliest ones.
Yeah.
Furthermore, its vocabulary and writing style are noticeably different from the rest of John.
So it doesn't sound like John wrote it.
It appears in later manuscripts, sometimes even placed in different Gospels altogether.
Really?
Yes. So while it may very well reflect a genuine tradition about something Jesus said or did.
It probably wasn't in John's original gospel.
Yeah. The evidence strongly suggests that, yes. You'll often see it set apart with brackets or footnotes in modern Bibles to indicate its uncertain place in the original text. It's a clear example of a substantial addition over time.
Okay. Mark 16.920 is another passage that often comes with a note in Bibles, right?
Yeah.
The ending of Mark's gospel.
Exactly. The longer ending of Mark. It details several post-resurrection appearances of Jesus and his ascension.
But it's not in the oldest manuscripts.
It's absent from the oldest and most reliable manuscripts of Mark's gospel. Ehrman, in line with the overwhelming consensus among textual critics, views this as a later addition.
Why add it?
Likely composed to provide a more complete and, well, satisfying conclusion to the gospel, which otherwise ends rather abruptly.
With the women fleeing the tomb in fear.
Exactly. It leaves you hanging a bit.
And what about the somewhat mysterious-sounding comma Johannium in 1 John 5.7 to 8?
That always seems like a very technical point. It is a bit technical, but significant. The comma Johannium is a specific passage that explicitly mentions the Trinity in a way that's quite unique in the New Testament.
What does it say?
For there are three that bear witness in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one.
That's very direct.
Very. Ehrman highlights that this passage is a relatively late addition to the text of 1 John. It's found primarily in later Latin manuscripts.
Not the early Greek ones.
Not the earliest Greek ones, no. There's a very strong scholarly consensus that it was not originally part of 1 John.
So it was inserted later.
Likely inserted later, probably in the context of theological debates about the Trinity, to provide what seemed like clearer scriptural support for the doctrine.
Got it. So modern translations often leave it out or footnote it.
Yes. You won't find it in most modern critical editions of the Greek New Testament, and many modern English translations either omit it or include it in footnotes with a clear indication of its late origin.
Okay. Moving on to Matthew 24.36, which deals with the timing of the end times. What's the variation there that Ehrman points out?
Matthew 24.36 states that no one knows the specific day or hour of the Lord's return, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only.
Nor the Son.
Right. Ehrman notes that in some later manuscripts, that phrase, nor the Son, is omitted.
Why would they take that out?
He suggests that this omission might have been a deliberate change made by scribes who felt uncomfortable with the idea of Jesus in his pre-ascended state, not possessing complete knowledge.
To protect the idea of his omniscience.
Potentially, yes, to uphold that doctrine. However, the earliest and most reliable manuscripts, as well as the parallel passage in Mark 13.32, do include the phrase, nor the Son.
So that's likely original.
That is what most scholars believe to be the original reading, yes.
Well, okay. John 1.18 has a variant that sounds pretty significant for understanding the identity of Jesus.
Yes. In John 1.18, some early and highly significant manuscripts read, unique God. The Greek is monogenes theos, instead of the more familiar translation, only Son. Monogenes huios.
Unique God versus only Son.
Exactly. Both readings actually have strong and early manuscript support, which makes it tricky.
So what's the implication?
Ehrman likely sees the unique God reading as potentially reflecting a very early and high Christology, emphasizing Jesus' divine nature in a very unique way, right there in the prologue of John.
Is there consensus on that one?
It's a particularly challenging textual decision. Even among contemporary scholars, there isn't complete consensus, although unique God is often favored in modern critical texts. Interestingly, both readings ultimately support a very high view of Christ's identity.
Luke 23.34a contains Jesus' famous words from the cross. What's the textual issue there?
Luke 23.34a records Jesus saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Incredibly poignant words.
Absolutely.
Ehrman points out that these words of forgiveness are absent from some important early manuscripts, including Codex Vaticanus and the early Papyrus P75. Yes. This absence raises questions about whether they were originally part of Luke's gospel.
Why might they be missing?
Various theories exist. Some suggest they might have been omitted later due to theological discomfort or even anti-Jewish sentiment. Others argue they were original and perhaps accidentally omitted in some lines of transmission.
If you don't know for sure.
It's debated. But the inclusion or exclusion certainly has a significant impact on how we understand Jesus' final moments.
Hebrews 2.9 has a variant that hinges on just a single letter difference in the Greek. That sounds like the kind of tiny error that could easily happen.
Yes, a classic scribal slip, potentially. In Hebrews 2.9, the vast majority of manuscripts read that Jesus tasted death by the grace of God, Theo.
Oh.
However, a few early, though less widely supported, manuscripts have a single letter difference in one word, reading, apart from God, Theo.
Apart from God, that's completely different.
As Ehrman highlights, this seemingly minuscule change would drastically alter the theological meaning of the verse. It's a huge difference.
But the evidence supports grace.
Yes, the reading by the grace of God fits much more coherently with the overall theology of Hebrews and is almost universally accepted by scholars as the original.
Okay. Luke 22.19b20 deals with the account of the Last Supper. What's the variation that Ehrman points to there?
In Luke 22, recounting the institution of the Lord's Supper, some manuscripts, most notably one called Codex Bezae, present a noticeably shorter version of Jesus' words.
Shorter how?
It omits key phrases that emphasize the atoning significance of his death, such as, which is given for you, and the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you.
So a less substitutionary atonement focus.
Potentially, yes. Ehrman draws attention to this shorter reading. However, the longer form of the passage is generally accepted by scholars as the original text of Luke.
Why?
It's supported by a wider range of early and reliable manuscripts.
Got it. Romans 5.1 also has a subtle but potentially significant difference in wording.
It does. In Romans 5.1, the difference in the original Greek hinges on the ending of a single verb. It distinguishes between we have peace, ekomen, and let us have peace, ekomen.
Just one letter.
One letter difference in Greek, yes. Both readings have significant manuscript support from early periods.
So a statement versus a command.
Exactly. As Ehrman notes, this seemingly small grammatical difference changes the verse from a statement of present reality, we have peace with God, to an exhortation or call to action, let us have peace with God.
Which one is likely original?
Textual scholars continue to debate that one. Both have theological implications for understanding the believer's relationship with God, and the evidence is quite divided.
Interesting. And finally, 1 Timothy 3.16, a verse that's often central in discussions about the divinity of Jesus. What's the key variant there?
In 1 Timothy 3.16, later manuscripts often read, God was manifested in the flesh, which is a very explicit statement of the incarnation.
It's very clear.
Very clear. However, the earliest and most reliable Greek manuscripts actually read, he who was manifested in the flesh.
He who instead of God.
Yes. Ehrman points out that the reading God was likely a later alteration, maybe made to provide a clearer and more direct affirmation of Jesus' divine nature.
So the original was less direct.
While the original reading, he who, still undoubtedly refers to Christ and supports a high Christology, it is less direct in its explicit identification of Jesus as God incarnate than the later reading.
Okay, so looking at all these examples, quite a few significant ones there. Ehrman's overarching argument is that these textual variations aren't just minor imperfections.
Right.
They can indeed have real consequences for how we interpret important theological concepts in specific passages.
That's his core contention.
He concludes that because of this history of transmission, this copying process, we can't have absolute certainty about the original wording in every single instance. This, in turn, leads him to challenge traditional views of the Bible's verbal inspiration and inerrancy, suggesting that it is, fundamentally, a human book shaped by its journey through history.
That's the thrust of Misquoting Jesus, yes.
But as you mentioned earlier, this perspective hasn't gone unchallenged. What has been the general response from other scholars in the field?
Right. Well, while the vast majority of scholars in New Testament textual criticism agree with Ehrman's fundamental premise that textual variations exist, and that some of them are indeed significant for interpreting specific verses.
They agree on the data, mostly.
They agree on the basic data, yes. But the overwhelming scholarly consensus remains that no essential doctrine of the Christian faith relies solely on a disputed passage.
Ah, okay. So core beliefs are still secure.
Core beliefs are supported by numerous verses whose textual integrity isn't seriously in question.
Yeah.
Prominent scholars, including Ehrman's own mentor, the late Bruce Metzger, held this view very strongly.
Metzger did. Interesting.
Yes. Furthermore, the sheer abundance of surviving manuscripts, while containing variations, also provides an unparalleled wealth of evidence.
We mentioned that earlier.
Right. It enables scholars to reconstruct the text with a remarkable degree of confidence, certainly more confidence than we have for most other ancient literary works.
So, the abundance of manuscripts, while the source of the variants, ultimately gives us more to work with in understanding the original. Kind of a double-edged sword.
Precisely. It's a strength in the process of reconstruction, even as it reveals the variations.
So what are the main criticisms of Ehrman's approach?
Critics often argue that he tends to, perhaps, overemphasize the theological significance of certain variants,
making them sound more damaging than they are.
and sometimes employs language that creates a greater sense of alarm about the reliability of the text than the evidence truly warrants, especially for a general audience.
Okay.
They also point out fairly that much of the information he presents regarding textual variants and the process of textual criticism has been well established within the field for a long time. It wasn't necessarily new discoveries he was revealing.
So known information presented in a new, maybe more alarming way.
That's one perspective. There have also been arguments that he sometimes selectively highlights evidence that best supports his conclusions and perhaps sets up simplified or extreme versions of views on biblical inspiration, so-called straw man arguments, in order to critique them more easily.
Right, critiquing a weaker version of the opposing view.
Potentially.
It sounds like while Misquoting Jesus brought some really important issues to the forefront and definitely sparked a lot of public discussion,
Undeniably.
the more far-reaching conclusions that Ehrman draws, particularly about undermining core doctrines or the overall reliability, are not universally accepted within the community of biblical scholars.
That's a very fair and balanced assessment. While the book undoubtedly played a significant role in raising public awareness about the complexities of the New Testament text and prompted valuable conversation.
Which is good.
Absolutely. Many scholars maintain that the New Testament text, despite the variations, remains remarkably reliable overall, and that the vast majority of these variations are indeed minor and do not fundamentally alter the core message of the Christian faith.
Has Ehrman responded to this?
Ehrman himself, actually, in later writings and in the afterward to subsequent editions of Misquoting Jesus, has acknowledged that his primary focus is more on how these variants affect the meaning of specific passages, rather than on overturning the central tenets of Christianity.
So a bit more nuanced than maybe the initial splash suggested.
Perhaps, but this crucial nuance sometimes gets lost in the broader public reception and the popular impact of the book.
Right, the headline version.
Exactly. So with all of this in mind, what does it all mean for you, the listener, who is engaging with these ideas?
That's the essential question, isn't it? This deep dive into Misquoting Jesus really illuminates a fascinating and, well, intricate history behind the very text that so many people hold sacred.
It's complex.
You've had the chance to hear Ehrman's arguments about the human role in the transmission of the Bible and the perspectives of other scholars who, while acknowledging the variations, emphasize the overall trustworthiness of the New Testament.
The key takeaway for you, I believe, is that grappling with these questions requires a nuanced and thoughtful approach. It's not black and white.
Not perfect preservation or complete corruption.
Exactly. It's not either. Instead, it's a compelling story of dedicated individuals who were also fallible human beings, diligently copying and sharing these profoundly important texts across many centuries, sometimes making mistakes, sometimes interpreting and clarifying as they went. This human element is an integral part of the story of the Bible.
That's a great way to put it. So what are some of the things this might prompt you, the listener, to consider moving forward? Perhaps it encourages you to take a closer look at different translations of the Bible. Notice the footnotes or annotations that often address these textual variations.
That's a very practical step, yes. See how translators handle these spots.
Maybe it fosters a deeper appreciation for the often unseen work of textual critics and the immense challenges they face trying to reconstruct ancient texts.
It's painstaking work, absolutely. Requires incredible skill and judgment.
Or perhaps it sparks further reflection on the very nature of divine inspiration and that complex interplay between the divine and the human in the creation and transmission of the scriptures we have today.
Big questions, but important ones raised by this discussion.
Definitely food for thought.
This deep dive, as we said at the beginning, is really just an entry point into a much larger and ongoing conversation.
Just scratching the surface.
The field of biblical textual criticism is incredibly rich and continues to be an active area of scholarly research. We sincerely hope that this discussion has provided you with a solid foundation for understanding the key issues raised by Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus.
And hopefully given you some intriguing avenues for further personal thought and exploration.